So here we are again for more family stories with Grandpa Dave. Still November 19th, 2016. And you said you had another thing you wanted to add to one of the stories we talked about before.
Yeah, one of your last questions was, did I show any hostility to Dean when he was born? I think, as I think about it, I was more hostile toward my mother for not saying anything than I was to Dean. How could I be hostile to Dean? Because I didn't know him, who he was. So the reason I think I was hostile was that she sent me over to the neighbors to play, and it was kind of unusual that she sent me over in my school clothes and school shoes and stuff. And well, that was fine, but then we got over there, and the only place they had to play was along the swamp. They lived between the swamp and the river. And then in the swamp there were some special flowers blooming, not kind of like daffodils. I'm trying to think of the name of the flowers. So anyway, I wasn't mad at my mother or anything. I just thought she might like flowers. She was always growing flowers around at home. So anyway, I crawled out to pick some of these flowers. The only way to get out there were on these sort of half-sunken logs in the swamp. And I misstepped and I fell in the water. I guess I fell in about up to my waist. And I was bringing my flowers to shore, and I thought, well, this feels kind of good. It was warm water for one thing. We hardly ever had any warm weather. This was in the spring. So I stayed around, kind of played in the water for a while. But then I realized, I was going to be in trouble when I'd come home because I had dirty clothes and wet shoes and stuff. But nothing I could do about it then. So I came home. It must have been a bedraggled kind of sight. I don't know how she was feeling after the birth of Dean and stuff. But she was so happy to see me, and she was glad nothing worse had happened to me. And I said, forgive me, I'm not a very good boy. Oh, I love you, she said. So that stuck with me afterwards, having mixed feelings, loving her and disliking her at the same time.
She kind of betrayed you a little bit with this new competitor, Dean.
Yeah, yeah. No, there was some hostility there. Once I got to know him, what the reality of the situation.
You had told us before that you shared a bed with him, and that you told us that story. By the way, can you keep your eyes open so we can see your eyes? I know, or it seems like you think better with your eyes closed sometimes. Is that part of it?
My eyes kind of hurt with the light.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. You can close them if you want. That's fine.
Anyway, we shared a bed, and so we had this actually happened back in Cambridge, not up in Cohasset, but we were encroaching on each other's territory and sleeping in the same bed. So my mother rolled up a quilt or a blanket or something and made a line down the middle of the bed, a cuckoo line, we called it. And anybody who encroached over on the line, a battle would ensue. And one night, Dean encroached over the line, and I hauled off and hit him in the face with my fist. Caused a nosebleed, and of course he started to cry. My mother came up, and there was blood on the bed, and over him and over me and stuff. We lived through that. Declared a truce afterwards.
How old was he then, do you remember?
Oh, he was probably 8 or 9 years old. We'd been back in Cambridge fact, we'd been back in Cambridge. By that time, I would have been 12 or 13 or something. So this would have been like 7 years later.
And did you move again then after this? Was this the
Yeah.
time when you lived near the lake again, or?
First, we lived next to the lake, the old farm homestead place,
Is that where you took care of the boats?
and took care of bailing the boats and stuff. And the lake was really our playground. We loved the lake. And we would swim, of course, and we would skate, and we tried to build sailboats and one thing and another. The most interesting time of the year, and I've talked to, again, to Dean, this is another water story, is when the lake would freeze over for the first time. It wouldn't completely freeze, it would just freeze around the floor, around the shore. And so the day that this would happen, we would come home from school, Dean and I, and it was half frozen, and you could walk on the ice. We called it rubber ice, and you could walk, but you couldn't walk very far before you would break through. And so the interesting thing was both my father and mother would watch us, kind of like they would like to do it too, but they just wanted to see us do it. So of course we would break through and get wet. But it was the only time of the year when we were sort of encouraged to get wet.
Hmm.
This all happened on Lake Fanny.
And how many rowboats did you have on Lake Fanny?
At the peak, we had 10 boats, I think. So this was kind of our cash crop. The Depression was coming to an end, but during the day you could rent out a boat for all day for 25 cents, and on Saturdays and Sundays it was 50 cents. But my dad always liked to have all the boats dry. He didn't like that customers would come and see half the boats had water in the bottom. And it wasn't water from leaking boats, it was water from the rain. So Dean and I, our big job was to keep those boats dry. But to lift up the boats and turn them over that way was too heavy for us, so we had to bail them out with coffee cans.
Hmm.
And if we had 10 boats, it could easily take an hour or two to bail all of them out.
Hmm. You couldn't put some kind of a cover on it to keep the rain out, particularly just didn't have anything to use for that probably.
Probably could, but you have to spend money for that.
Yeah.
So, and then at the end of the war, not the end of the war, end of the Depression, then the prices went up, so it was 50 cents during the week, and then it was 50 cents for half a day on Saturday or Sunday, and $1 for the whole day.
And would people rent them to go fishing mostly, or
Yeah,
just
fishing.
Yeah.
That was the only thing they did with them, was fishing.
Mm.
It wasn't a popular lake for fishing, but it had some northern in it, and there were a lot of crappies and sunfish.
It was relatively close to town.
Right. And people came from Minneapolis to fish.
And so you moved from that farm then to the farm I remember.
Yeah, the farm near town. I was about 12 or 13 years old when we did that.
So did you give Dean his bloody nose in the new house or the old house, do you remember?
A new house.
The new house.
Must have given it to him when I was about that age.
Yeah. And you guys are both going to a one-room schoolhouse?
Yeah, that was another good thing about it. I liked that it was actually a two-room schoolhouse. One room was for the first 4 grades, The second room was for grades 5 through 8. And I loved it because there were only 4 of us in our class, so you got a lot of individual attention. And then if your own class was too boring, you could listen either to a class ahead or a class behind. And I was telling Chris that the library was inadequate, only 2 shelves of books, which I quickly read. But I sat near the back because I was one of the smarter students. Right behind me were the encyclopedias on the wall. So whenever things got too boring, I would go back and pick out an encyclopedia and read. I really liked reading encyclopedias. So I learned a lot, but it was disorganized. So I say that I'm good at things like Trivia Pursuit, but not so good when it takes to organizing everything.
And if I recall, Ina Abramson, who later became a friend of ours, was your 8th grade algebra teacher, was it?
9th grade. She was my teacher when I first started high school.
Which high school did you go to?
It was Cambridge High School. So then I could take the bus to school.
And Grandma wouldn't follow you anymore then?
No, she didn't follow me anymore. And I also could ride my bicycle to school.
Which was, what, a mile away or a couple miles?
Just a mile to school then.
Was it a very big high school?
Well, there were about 65 of us in each class, 65 in our freshman class. So it seemed big to me, you know, to go from having 5 in our class to 65.
And you liked high school too?
Yeah, not as much as grade school for some reason. I liked grade school, but I liked high school enough to feel like I would like to be a high school teacher. That became my goal when I was in high school. I would like to be a high school teacher and teach geography and history. I really liked geography better, but I never knew anybody that made a living out of geography. It seemed like there were history teachers hither and yon, but I didn't know any geography teachers. We didn't have any in our school. Later on I discovered, like in college, economic geography and stuff like that. Otherwise I probably would have become some kind of geographer. I like drawing maps. I was big on maps.
So you...
But I didn't play basketball or football, even though the principal, who was actually a relative, he was a second cousin of my mother's. He on my registration slip said he thought I should go out for either basketball or football. And that probably would have been a good idea, but I wanted to work instead, so I got a job in the local laundry. And I could start saving money and using money for different things I wanted. When I was in plays, the first play I was in high school was The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. I was an old hillbilly. I was smoking a corncob pipe, sitting on my broken down porch in the Appalachian someplace.
Did you have...
And I didn't know that I was being set up. But anyway, it opened with something about, here I am in my old cabin waiting for this or that. Only I'd never had any speech training, so I started out, here am I sitting in my old cabin. And the crowd really laughed like mad because the idea of this supposed to be a hillbilly, and he talked like an old Swede. So that was the biggest laugh of the evening, opening line. But I enjoyed it.
Did you have any other parts in plays?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of the next one I was in with. Had a Spanish name to it, some Marquita thing. But I liked being on the stage crew. That was one of my high school activities, was building sets and handling the lighting. At one point we had an argument between the drama teacher and the stage teacher, and so this stage crew people decided to strike against the dramatic people. But I liked the play so much that I broke the striker's line. And so in between my lines in the play, I would go back and handle the lights. So sometimes we'd have a really quick sunset or a quick sunrise. So I was working on the lighting. But I had almost a bad accident. I was hurrying around too much. And the footlights, I don't know if they still do it or not, but there was big, like a screwdriver, a big silver screwdriver to open and close the footlights on the stage. And one night after it was finished, I knew exactly where this ledge was where you kept the key, but there was no light back there that night. So I thought, well, I know where to set this key down. Well, instead of setting it on its little ledge, I touched one of the hot wires in the box for the lighting. Next thing I knew, I was on the floor in a big fireworks of lights. And where I had touched the key was a silver key. It actually burned into the key, made a depression in the key. That was the fireworks, were little pieces of the key flying in every direction.
Yikes. You almost shorted out the whole thing there, huh?
Well, I didn't short it out, but I certainly just about shorted myself out.
You almost got electrocuted.
Threw me down on the floor.
Yikes. So you were at Cambridge High School for 4 years.
4 years.
And you were working how many hours a week?
I worked a couple hours, usually after school, and then I'd work on Saturdays. I never worked on Sundays. They had me working in dry cleaning, and I think that might have been illegal because it was considered hazardous work. The dry cleaning was done in a separate little building outside the main laundry building. But everybody was drafted. There wasn't anybody of draft age to run dry cleaning, so they had an old guy who was half blind, and he smoked. And he would scare me because he'd be leaning over the dry cleaning machines, which were filled with some kind of gasoline. I expected the whole place to go up sometime or another, but it never did, even though ash from his cigar would drop down into the dry cleaning fluid. So I guess I wasn't as flammable as I thought.
It sounds dangerous, though.
It was dangerous, but I didn't know any better.
Did you work there from your freshman year on?
Yeah. And I worked in the office too, off and on. And
the school office?
No, the dry cleaning office. And the owner of the dry cleaning plant, his wife, worked the office, but there had been different burglaries and what do you call it, when people stop you and rob you on the street.
Mugging, robbery.
Muggings, yeah, there had been some muggings around.
In Cambridge, really?
In Cambridge, yeah.
Wow.
So she was afraid. She was the last one to leave the office in the night or on Saturdays. So she thought it would be safer if I carried the cash myself on my bicycle. So for a while I was carrying I'm sure there were never more than maybe $50 or something, but I was the incognito Brinks car there.
So you would have graduated, what was your class? You graduated class of
1947.
And were you like valedictorian or something?
I was valedictorian.
And then you, what did you do that summer before Gustavus then?
Well, I immediately went to Alaska. That was my main.
Is that your first Alaska trip?
First Alaska trip. Paul up in Alaska, my mother's brother, could use some extra help. So he said if I came, he would pay my room and board, and I could get a job in Anchorage. I could keep that money for college. That was the deal. So, and he said, if you don't want to do it by yourself, you pick out somebody to come with you. The two of you could come. Well, by that time I had met Harold Larson. He was from Chicago, and I considered him a man who knew the ways of the world, and I thought he'd be a good one to have on a trip like that because I'd never done such a trip.
Was he older than you?
Same age, almost exactly, just 2 months older than I was. The way I met him was that his folks lived in Chicago, but they had relatives in Cambridge because they both came from Cambridge parents. And so as soon as he came, he started going to our church and also Bible camp. That was my first Bible camp was in 1943. That was when I was just a freshman in college, and he was there because there was a polio epidemic in Chicago, and his folks were afraid he would get polio. It seemed like polio was bad until the first frost, and then for some reason, after the first frost, it would let up. So he came up then first for the summer, and I was with him in Bible camp, and then he started our freshman year in high school until the first frost, and then he went back to Chicago. So anyway, he and I went to Alaska together for the first trip. And that was a big adventure for me because I'd been to Chicago a couple times with my mother when she went to visit. Hilder lived in Chicago for a while. So I had been to Chicago for a week or two, but nothing bigger than Chicago. So to take the train from Minneapolis to Seattle, that was a big thrill. And then to get on the ship from Seattle to Seward, that was also a big thrill. And then of course to be in Anchorage and make different trips like to glaciers and gold panning, and like on weekends we would usually make some kind of trip. And I earned enough money in the summer to pay for my college